I just want to start by asking you about the experience in New York City. What role do urban food gardens play in promoting food security in the New York context?
Yeah, thanks for asking that question because I think because of COVID, it really heightened the responsibility of urban agriculture and community gardens in the city. You know, there was one point where people say, oh, you know, you have these community gardens and they're going to grow food to feed the masses. And it wasn't about that. It was about people within communities growing food that was healthy, that was culturally appropriate, and growing food in a way that was sustainable for their source of living. And so I think what the pandemic had done is really bring to the forefront how essential these community gardens are. But what it does is give people an opportunity to grow their own food. And I think that's really, really important because I think when you are a person that have ownership of growing your own food, in a sense gives you power. You know, you understand where your food comes from. You're able to share. It's a way of culture, of tradition, of a lot of things that are happening within those small spaces that are needed.
And what does a successful food garden look like?
Well, a successful food garden will look like and can look like if there's a partnership between community and government. And I say that because I said in New York City and within the country, any land and any municipality has political consequences. Because at one time, there was a sprawl of so many vacant lots. The city didn't have any money, and so people came in and turned those empty lots into community gardens. But then as the community garden movement started to flourish, all of a sudden, here comes big development coming in and saying, whoa, these communities look good. Whoa, you know, we can take these gardens and we can build housing and whoa. And it's like, wait a second, you know, we've been here when nobody wanted to be here. Yes, there's a need for development, don't get me wrong. But how can you work with development, green space, and politicians and the political will to work together? And so for us, we were able to march and get the heir of that time, who was the Attorney General, Eliot Spitzer. And so that was the beginning of people understanding their civil rights, but also for government to understand what the people were trying to say. I always tell government, you know, in communities, ask us what we want instead of what we need. When you ask a community like us what we want, it comes from a position of power. Asking us what we need comes from a position of deficit. And so trying to have that marriage that works where you have the community and you have the political will working together, which is really, really important.
So once those basics are in place, once the land, you know, is available, are there any other essential components in your experience that make a garden thrive?
It's always good to have capital and resources. I think in the very beginning, it was sort of this guerrilla gardening movement where we just went in and took on spaces and just started growing. But now we realize that, you know, we need help. First of all, in New York City, they had to come up with a concept on how to protect those gardens. I couldn't say preserve, but protect those gardens. So they came up with a lease program where you have a lease agreement to work in these spaces for 4 years. They'll give out gardening starts so that people can start thinking about the types of plants that they want to grow in their garden. They'll also provide us with free composting and free water. Free water. A lot of people, believe it or not, in other places they have to pay for water. But the city allows us to use the municipal water free of charge. Again, we have fencing. It's not open space. And another thing that we don't have to pay for, we're fighting, is for insurance.
So often I've heard you speak about gardens as more than food. Can you say a little bit about how they can act as a place to build collective action?
You know, in the beginning, I was focusing on just growing food. But while I was in that garden, I started to hear social issues around the environment, people having high incidence of asthma, social issues around health, people having problems with type 2 diabetes, obesity, because of the food that they're eating. Economics, people having problems trying to find a job, a living wage job. And so for me, all of a sudden, I had to look at, gardening differently, and that food was at the center, and it was all interconnected. And so for me, people will ask time and time again, is the food system broken and needs to be fixed? Yes, it does. And then I realized, wait a second, it's doing exactly what it's supposed to be doing. It's a care system. So the food system doesn't need to be fixed. It needs to change. And that change comes with community power. Putting the power back into the hands of the community to make decisions, and putting that power back into their own hands to think about them being self-sufficient and self-reliant. What is so scary about that? What is so scary about people trying to feed their own families, using community gardens as an access for food, but also as a consciousness of civil engagement? Not only do you as a community benefit, but the government itself benefits, because the government doesn't want to see people who are poor and impoverished, because that puts a lot of burden on the capitalistic problems, of economics.
Yeah, you mentioned government, and that we were talking about this earlier. I mean, can you give us some examples of how maybe at the local level government has supported food gardens?
First of all, in New York City, for the first time, after years, I got gray hair, after years of letting the city understand the importance of community gardens, there's now an office of urban agriculture happening for the first time. And so when we talk about urban agriculture, because this is happening around the country, we're not only talking about community gardens, but we're talking about all phases of growing food: rooftops, greenhouses, aquaponics, hydroponics, community gardens. For the first time at the city level, there are going to be policies in place on how to regulate food production.
So the question is, in your view, how can those relationships that you've kind of outlined for us, government, private sector, not-for-profit sector, be strengthened to support food security?
Yeah, first of all, understand what people are trying to do. They're just trying to feed their family. Understand that. And not be afraid to give people pockets of land, especially those that are in impoverished area. Because let's face it, folks, I'm 68 years of age. I'm not owning nothing, because I don't live long enough to own. We don't live long enough to own anything. So why do we always think about owning something that we don't live long enough to own? I'm a steward of the land. I'm a caretaker of the land, because being a steward or a caretaker of the land, I know that land will go on from generations to generations, and not about owning something that I know I'm not going to live long enough to even possess. There is this mindset that by helping poor people, you're taking something away from people who are wealthy. No. You help poor people to move up. What is it that's preventing society for people to grow their own food in small spots? It's a win-win for everybody. It's a win-win, especially globally. We're trying to fight hunger and poverty, and I hear from the lips of so many people is that we want people to eat healthy food. Well, if you give them the ability to grow their own food, that's a step in the right direction.